welcome to another episode of Film Shocks with Hitchcock, my year-long journey with the master of suspense. Yes, it has been a while. I've not done one of these since around 2022. That's when I started. I think I got into April of 2022 with the number 17. And I've been on a bit of a pause ever since then. A lot of videos on the channel have been on a pause, but I'm trying to get back into it, get back into the groove of things, and try to get back onto this podcast in particular for episodes every Sunday. Originally, it was meant to be a year-long journey, given that there were, I believe, 52 films that were available to watch from Alfred Hitchcock. So it's not really going to be a year-long journey anymore. It's a multi-year journey, but the point is, I'm going to try to keep it up now. I see some of the reactions to the Hitchcock episodes. I've seen some of the view counts, and I've been pretty impressed by some of the different comments that people have made, and the fact that there's been quite a few views on it compared to some of my other videos. So thank you so much for giving them a listen, for sticking around with them. This is the first time I've really ever done a podcast on my own. I usually have other people working with me, so this is kind of a unique form for me. It seems that the less loved a Hitchcock movie is, the less information there's going to be. There's definitely books where some of the Hitchcock experts dive into the lesser-known work a lot more than what you'll find from IMDb, something like that. Waltzes From Vienna, released in 1934, unless, depending on the source you're reading, some people claim that it came out in 1933. Even one of the books that I rely on mentions that it was released in 1933. I don't see any proof of that. From what I've read, the movie premiered in 1934. So Waltzes From Vienna is considered one of the least known Hitchcock movies. Even if you go on Letterboxd, this movie is his least popular. It sits right at the bottom, even below Juno and the Paycock. I would have to say that maybe Juno and the Paycock's a little more popular just because of the title. You know, that title is one that you're not going to forget. Waltzes From Vienna is kind of generic as a title. It's also generic as a story. It's about Johann Strauss and his son, and it's technically a true story. There was beef between the two composers in the 19th century, and the story is about creating the famous piece, The Blue Danube. But that doesn't seem to interest modern audiences, and even the film itself didn't really interest Hitchcock. Hitchcock has always talked badly about the movie anytime that it came up. Hitchcock in the Truffaut book basically says it's his lowest ebb. He kind of used that same wording for Champagne, another movie that he made earlier in 1928. So to use this movie as well as his lowest ebb, I don't know which one is more true. I have to assume the only reason he maybe considered this his lowest ebb is, one, the subject matter. It's not something that he would typically do. It's a period piece. It's sometimes considered a musical, but it's really not at all. It's not a musical. I don't know how it really gets categorized that way. There's music moments in it, yeah. There's singing. There's, of course, The Blue Danube. There's a great performance of it towards the end of the film, but it's not really a musical. Really, it's not. It's not a musical. So for anybody calling it a musical, maybe people are keeping away from it because it's a musical. I wouldn't stay away from it just because of that. But I feel like the second reason he considered this a lower point in his career would be because, in hindsight, it led to some greater successes. Right after this, he would end up doing The Man Who Knew Too Much. He would follow that up with The 39 Steps. I mean, these are great movies. These are still considered some of the best to come from Hitchcock. So I feel like when he was, talking with Truffaut at the time, that maybe in hindsight, the great waltz, or, the Waltzes From Vienna, I should mention that in America, it was released as Strauss's Great Waltz. And in some cases, the movie is still called that all over the internet in different books, and especially in bootleg DVD releases. But the movie's original title is Waltzes From Vienna. I think even the title card in the movie has never been changed for those various bootleg releases. But I feel like because this movie was right before those works, Hitchcock just thought all the less about this movie, which is really too bad because, with all that, and the fact that it's not popular on Letterboxd, it's incorrectly categorized as a musical. So, knowing that it's a Hitchcock musical, something that he's never done before, something that he wouldn't do again, and something that he already disliked, walking into the movie, I was really preparing for something that wasn't going to be good, something that wasn't going to be enjoyable. I mean, this is still the early 30s. He has put himself into the sound era now. He's gotten very used to sound. But some of his movies were still not featuring, musical scores. This movie obviously has a musical score, but at this point he's very used to music, but it's still the early 1930s. I don't exactly know what to expect as far as that era of movie. Sometimes it can be awkward to watch in modern times, and I just didn't expect much at all given everything going into it. And frankly, I ended up liking the movie quite a bit. I didn't think it was, it's not boring at all. I think it has a nice enough story. Granted, it doesn't really dive too much into the story, and we'll go into it, but some different things don't really work with it. But it's unfortunate that this movie has the reputation it does, partly built by the way that, Hitchcock would talk about it, but also the fact that in modern times, it doesn't seem like a lot of people are going back to this movie. For it being this low on Letterboxd, as far as popularity, it surprises me. Because there are other movies that Hitchcock made before this that, let me tell you, are not good at all. Number 17, I mean, I'm still trying to figure out what even is going on in that movie. Before this movie, he was going to direct a film titled Lord Camber's Ladies, but he ended up producing it instead. And in fact, that's the only movie that he's produced that he wouldn't direct. He ended up giving the movie to his friend Ben Levy, and according to Paul Condon and Jim Sangster's book, it sounded like the two had a falling out after that movie or during the film's production, and they never spoke again, unfortunately. I did not get to watching that movie. That movie seems even more obscure than the one we're discussing today. And then sometimes this movie gets confused with other American movies that are titled The Great Waltz. It makes it more confusing because in America, this movie was known as Strauss's Great Waltz. There was the film from 1938 and a remake in 1972. There was even a TV movie in 1955. So a lot of confusion there about what this movie even is, because those other movies are about Johann Strauss's life, but this movie is specifically about the making of The Blue Danube and the ongoing beef between father and son. This ended up being the first film that Hitchcock did with Gaumont British Picture Corporation before he was with British International Pictures. And this movie ended up being the first of a few other movies later that he would do with the same company. In fact, this movie was apparently the one where he was able to sell the idea for The Man Who Knew Too Much, and that ended up being his immediate follow-up. The older Strauss is played by Edmund Gwenn, who also appeared in The Skin Game, and he will later return for Foreign Correspondent. He's probably most notable for his Hitchcock film The Trouble with Harry, but I probably know him best for Miracle on 34th Street, where he played Santa Claus. Frank Vosper plays Prince Gustav, and he would return for the immediate follow-up, The Man Who Knew Too Much. Other than that, there's not too many recurring Alfred Hitchcock actors in this one. Jessie Matthews plays Rezzy, the star female of the film, and apparently her and Hitchcock didn't get along too well on set. From her own accounts, it sounds like he was a bit of a jokester during their rehearsals, and it was just making it difficult to work with. Whatever the story is, they didn't end up working together again. The story is essentially about Johann Strauss Sr. and Johann Strauss Jr., usually using the names Johann Strauss I and Johann Strauss II. In the film, the younger Johann Strauss goes by the name Shani. The younger Strauss is trying to make a name for himself as a composer, but his father wants nothing of it. Very strangely, I read a synopsis of this movie online where it made it sound like the older Strauss didn't want him to be a musician and instead pushed him to be a baker. That's not really what happens in the movie. Instead, the younger Strauss leaves his father's band since he is one of the violinists, and he ends up meeting a girl named Rezzy. Rezzy is the daughter of the baker, who's portrayed by Robert Hale. He works with Rezzy to perform music. That's actually where we find them in the opening scene. During this moment, they're playing upstairs of the bakery, and there's a fire going on below. This is where a lot of the slapstick starts to come in. It's very heavy in the opening of the film, and it starts to scatter throughout the rest of it. There's a lot more slapstick to be found here than what I found in some of the other Hitchcock movies that came before. Hindel Edgar plays one of the Baker employees named Leopold. He climbs up the ladder and clearly has a love for the lady and decides he's going to save her. In the process, he's carrying her down the ladder and she loses her skirt. Now, there's no nudity, of course. This is the 30s, but we do see her undergarments. This is 19th century undergarments, so they're not really all that revealing, but, it leads to some hilarity from the crowd who's watching it. In fact, this whole crowd doesn't seem to care that there's a fire going on anyway. It's a very strange opening scene. But like I said, it's mostly there to create a lot of slapstick at the start. You would think that there's going to be a love triangle going on between Leopold, the younger Strauss, or Shawnee as he's called in the film, and the main actress Resi. But that doesn't really happen. There's not really a love triangle between these three. Instead, there's Countess Helga von Stahl, played by Faye Compton. She steps in because she's impressed by Strauss's work and wants to help him make a name for himself. Through the course of this, Resi gets jealous of the Countess and goes between wanting nothing to do with Strauss and at other times wanting him to join her father's bakery and hopefully start a life together. Resi becomes so bossy of Shawnee, the younger Strauss, to a degree that she just starts to become unlikable. She wants him to have nothing to do with this Countess, which in turn means he's going to have nothing to do with becoming a composer. But it doesn't seem like the Countess herself really has the affection towards the younger Strauss that Resi seems to think. It's more about his career, the fact that the Countess created these lyrics and wants to put them into a song, which ends up becoming the Blue Danube. It seems like she cares more for his career versus actually having an affection towards him. In fact, this affection doesn't really become a thing until the very end of the film, when she arrives at his apartment and it turns out maybe she is in love with the Strauss. So there's not a lot of good 1930s screwball comedy to be found here. It's just mostly annoyance from Resi that Strauss has anything to do with this Countess. The Countess who's trying to help him make a career for himself. The older Strauss wants nothing to do with this composed piece from his son. He doesn't believe in the son's talents, and by the time that the son goes and works at the bakery, we don't even see much from the older Strauss. It's very weird. I feel like this should have been a focal point of the movie, this relationship between father and son, but it never really becomes a focal point in the story. Even towards the end of the movie, where the younger Strauss finally gets to perform the piece, at first the older Strauss is disappointed and annoyed that he's been tricked out of his position as composer and shows disdain for his son. Yet by the end of the film, when he's doing an autograph for a fan, the older Strauss puts in his name, Senior, as a way to indicate to the audience that he has now accepted his son as a composer and as a popular name in music. In any case, the love triangle and the father-son relationship are done pretty weakly. Everything is there, but for 1930 standards, it's pretty weak. And if these are the issues that Hitchcock had with the movie, then I would agree. When the younger Strauss is first brought into the bakery, he needs to trick the father into thinking he's only there to work. The father is so happy that he shows him around the bakery and how they create all the goods. This scene is one of the highlights, as they're making the dough, throwing bread around as the mixer is going. Shawnee, the younger Strauss, actually starts performing the music in his head, and the music matches up with the performances from the actors. As he watches the mixer spin, he asks for it to be spun faster and faster, and he wants the tempo to reach the tempo that he's creating in his head for the Blue Danube. It's actually where he ends up creating the entire song. And there's a few moments like that where the music ties into the editing and some of the different scenes. There's actually another slapstick scene with a character falling down a flight of stairs, and as he does so, a piano plays the music as he falls down. There's actually piano being played in the other room, so it's not just there in the score, it's actually in the scene itself. I thought that was a nice touch, even if it's a bit cliche. I mean, even for that era, it was probably a common trope in films. As we get to the end of the film, there's a festival. Shawnee, the younger Strauss, is not up for playing, but the older Strauss is supposed to play with his orchestra. During this time, there's a setup created by the Countess and her accomplice, Dexler, played by Marcus Barron. These two plot to have the older Strauss distracted before his performance. He ends up being late, and the only one who can save the day is the younger Strauss. The younger Strauss is only there, seemingly to watch the show, but then Resi drags him over back to the Baker Company where they make up after a previous fight, and the bakery is there to cater the event, so naturally he starts helping. He has no idea that this setup is even being created. He has no idea that his father is being distracted. And when the Countess gets a chance, she talks to him and has him go upstage to perform the Bleu Danube, saying that his father approved of the performance, even though an earlier scene would show that he didn't like the composition at all. They perform the Bleu Danube to its entirety, and this is the great moment. I just like listening to the music, and there's a lot of great cuts. They cut back to the band, specific instruments where those levels are heard more than the rest of the band. You know, they cut to a drum, and then you can really hear those drums pop, and it's a really great moment. And sure, it's probably common for this era of films where a lot of the sound was driven by music itself, but it's still very familiar for modern types of movies where similar types of editing tricks are done. In fact, there's a great editing trick done earlier where the camera is passing through the festival grounds. As it pans across the party, a man's coat walks by, and you can see that there's a cut done. When the coat passes by, you see a different portion of the party, making it feel even larger than what the set probably is itself. Then the camera passes by a tree, and on the other side of the tree, it's a very obvious cut and a very obvious different part of the grounds. You see a man and woman kissing behind the tree, and then we get to see more of the party. It's an interesting way to make the party seem even larger than it probably is, but also it's the type of editing trick that Hitchcock would become famous for in Rope. Rope was a movie that he shot in one take, but in order to do that at the time, he would have to find ways to cut, usually by zooming in on like a box or a table, use something else to cover up the frame, and then he would cut back and it would actually be a new reel, but the audience would have no idea that there was even a cut. As the movie ends, the older Strauss is still completely disturbed by what the younger Strauss did to him. He thinks he's involved even though he wasn't at all. He runs home, and then it gets a little weird here. They didn't really properly set up this love triangle, so eventually the Countess goes to his apartment, and this is the moment where she finally makes it seem like she has an affection towards him, a romantic affection. The prince, played by Frank Vosper, knows that this happens, so he chases them down, ends up at the apartment himself, and wants to get into the room where they're hiding the Countess. She goes hiding into a room. There's a bit of a scuffle, some more slapstick because he grabs like a chair and he starts breaking it against the doorway. At one point, he finds her scarf. He's like, this is her scarf. And he's trying to rush into that room. And then the younger Strauss tries to stop him. And the scarf gets clipped onto the younger Strauss's button. And then they're both trying to fumble around to unloosen it. So more of that slapstick shows up here. Resi, learning that the prince is chasing them down, decides to also go to the apartment, followed by the entire party who wants Strauss to perform again. She runs up the stairs, but in a clever last-minute twist, she hops into the bedroom window, switches places with the Countess, and when she reveals herself, the prince realizes that the Countess was never there anyway, even though she very much was there. The Countess goes around the building, climbs up the stairs, and the prince, through all the confusion, realizes that the Countess wasn't at the apartment, that really it was a misunderstanding. It doesn't really resolve everything because really the Countess was there, and she does have this romantic affection towards the younger Strauss, Johnny, and Resi, seems to know that the Countess was there, but then she's now fine with Shani, and then they embrace, and I guess it's a happy ending. It's very confusing because, like I said, they just don't set all of this up properly. There's not really a moment for Resi to accept Shani for his composer traits or to really believe in what he is doing. And the same can be said for the father-son relationship because, as I said, the ending of the movie is the father signing the autograph using the term senior as a way to indicate that he has accepted his son, even though the last personal conversation they had was another argument. So really, things get resolved, I guess, but not in a very satisfying way. It seems like they were rushing to the finish almost, even though the movie still was around 77 minutes long. So they had time to properly dive into all of this, but a lot of that gets lost. And on that point, this movie is 77 minutes long, but commonly online I find that it runs for 80 minutes, 81 minutes. The version I watched must have been a PAL version, because the PAL version does run closer to 76, 77 minutes. This is one of the stranger releases for Hitchcock because there's nothing officially released in the US that I know of. The movie has yet to hit Blu-ray anywhere, but it does have a DVD release in France. It's from Universal, and it runs at the PAL length of 77 minutes. So I'm assuming that has to be the version I watch because I only found it on YouTube. There's not really another way for me to watch it in the US unless I watch one of those bootleg versions. And even the bootleg version isn't the easiest thing to find. Even a lot of the public domain box sets that I have, Waltzes From Vienna is typically not included. Again, that has to probably go back to the fact that it's so unknown as a Hitchcock movie. It doesn't really have any of the attributes of a Hitchcock movie, and the title itself is so generic. So even as a bootleg copy, it just often goes missing in a lot of those public domain DVD sets. As for the future, if this movie will be hitting Blu-ray, I'm not sure. I mean, maybe Kino can get on it at some point. They've done some of the other Hitchcock movies. Criterion has done some of the Hitchcock movies, especially from Gaumont British Pictures. I mean, they did release The Man Who Knew Too Much, 39 Steps, Foreign Correspondent. They did those movies, so maybe they could get to this one at some point. But even this is one of those movies that I don't often feel like come up when talking about like the BFI restorations, for instance. In fact, there's a more recent Blu-ray that was done in the UK that has brought some of the movies from Hitchcock's filmography that have never been on Blu-ray before, like Juno and the Paycock. But this movie's not included. So will it ever get a proper restoration? Will it ever hit Blu-ray? I really don't know. This one seems the most unlikely of the bunch to hit Blu-ray, especially in the US. And yet, I do enjoy the movie. I thought the movie was fine. I thought the pacing was pretty nice. I like those music moments, especially when the editing ties in with it. The performances are fine, and even though I don't think the father-son relationship, the love triangle, those aspects maybe don't work too well, but, you know, enough is there to keep you invested. It doesn't all land in the best way, but it kept me invested long enough to watch that first performance of the Blue Danube, and that is a great scene. A lot of what you've come to expect from Hitchcock movies is missing here, but he still has a few editing tricks here and there, and I can totally understand why Hitchcock maybe didn't like this movie all that much. It is by far the least Hitchcock movie I've seen so far. And yet, a lot of his sequences in later movies would tie directly to music, and this is the first notable example I've seen of that. So I think there were still things he learned from this movie that he would carry to other movies, but still, he didn't really want to acknowledge this one. For what the story is, I thought it was told fine enough. I would give it 3 out of 5 stars. It's not one of the better Hitchcock movies, obviously, but I still think it's worth watching if you're looking out for earlier Hitchcock movies. It's certainly better than some of the other ones that I watched that came before this. And just like the rest of the internet, I don't really have much else to say about Waltzes From Vienna, except that it's underrated. Give it a look if you're watching some earlier Hitchcock work. And it's time to go on to The Man Who Knew Too Much. Finally, we're starting to hit the popular Hitchcock work. We're going to have fun the next couple of weeks. Thanks for listening, everyone.
This concludes my part of the program. Next time, I shall return with another story.